measures of William's reign, and one in fact for which it has been particularly famous in modern times, was a grand census or registration of the kingdom, which the Conqueror ordered, with a view of having on record a perfect enumeration and description of all the real and personal property in the kingdom. This grand national survey was made in 1078. The result was recorded in two volumes of different sizes, which were called the Great and the Little Domesday Book. These books are still preserved, and are to this day of the very highest authority in respect to all questions touching ancient rights of property. One is a folio, and the other a quarto volume. The records are written on vellum, in a close, abridged, and, to ordinary readers, a perfectly unintelligible character. The language is Latin, but a modern Latin scholar, without any means other than an inspection of the work, would be utterly unable to decipher it. In fact, though the character is highly wrought, and in some respects elegant, the whole style and arrangement of the work is pretty nearly on a par, in respect to scientific skill, with Queen Emma's designs upon the Bayeux tapestry. About a half century ago, copies of these works were printed, by means of type made to represent the original character; but these printed editions were found unintelligible and useless until copious indexes were prepared and published to accompany them, at great expense of time and labour. Some little idea of the character and the style of this celebrated record may be obtained from the following specimen, which is as faithful an imitation of the original as any ordinary typography will allow. And here should be an illustration. The passage, deciphered and expressed in full, stands thus, the letters omitted in the original above being supplied in italics: In Brixton 100 Rex tenet per Munsey, heraldus comes tenuit, tunc se defendebat pro vigintitres hidis modo pro duodecim hidis, terra est octo carucatarum, in dominio est una carucata, et viginti quinque villani et triginta tres bordari cum una carucata, ibi nova et pulchra ecclesia et viginti acra prati. Silva quinque porces de pasnagio. The English translation is as follows: In Brixton 100, the king holds Bermondsey. Earl Harold held it before. At that time it was rated at 13 hides, now at 12. The arable land is 8 carucates, or plowlands. There is 1 carucate in demesne, and 25 villeins, and 33 bordars, with 1 carucate. There is a new and handsome church, with 20 acres of meadow, and woodland for 5 hogs in pasnage, or pasturage time. But we must pass on to the conclusion of the story. About the year 1082, Queen Matilda's health began seriously to decline. She was harassed by a great many anxieties and cares connected with the affairs of state which devolved upon her, and arising from the situation of her family. These anxieties produced great dejection of spirits, and aggravated, if they did not wholly cause her bodily disease. She was at this time in Normandy. One great source of her mental suffering was her anxiety in respect to one of her daughters, who, as well as herself, was declining in health. Forgetting her own danger, in her earnest desires for the welfare of her child, she made a sort of pilgrimage to a monastery which contained the shrine of a certain saint, who, as she imagined, had power to save her daughter. She laid a rich present on the shrine. She offered before it most earnest prayers, imploring with tears of bitter grief the intercession of the saint, and manifesting every outward symbol of humility and faith. She took her place in the religious services of the monastery, and conformed to its usages as if she had been in the humblest private station. But all was in vain. The health of her beloved daughter continued to fail, until at length she died; and Matilda, growing herself more feeble and almost broken hearted through grief, shut herself up in the palace at Caen. It was in the same palace which William had built within his monastery many long years before, at the time of their marriage. Matilda looked back to that period, and to the buoyant hopes and bright anticipations of power, glory, and happiness which then filled her heart with sadness and sorrow. The power and the glory had been attained, and in a measure tenfold greater than she had imagined. But the happiness had never come. Ambition had been contending unceasingly for 20 years among all the branches of her family, against domestic peace and love. She possessed herself an aspiring mind, but the principles of maternal and conjugal love were stronger in her heart than those of ambition. And yet she was compelled to see ambition bearing down and destroying love in all its form everywhere around her. Her last days were embittered by the breaking out of new contests between her husband and her son. Matilda sought for peace and comfort in multiplying her religious services and observances. She fasted, she prayed, she interceded for the forgiveness of her sins with many tears. The monks celebrated mass at her bedside, and made, as she thought, by renewing the sacrifice of Christ, a fresh propitiation for her sins. William, who was then in Normandy, hearing of her forlorn and unhappy condition, came to see her. He arrived just in time to see her die. They conveyed her body from the palace in her husband's monastery at Caen to the convent which she had built. It was received there in solemn state, and deposited in the tomb. For centuries afterwards there remained many memorials of her existence and her greatness there, in paintings, embroideries, sacred gifts, and records, which have been gradually wasted away by the hand of time. They have not, however, fully disappeared, for travellers who visit the spot find that many memorials and traditions of Matilda linger there still. William himself did not live many years after the death of his wife. He was several years older than she. In fact, he was now considerably advanced in age. He became extremely corpulent as he grew old, which, as he was originally of a large frame, made him excessively unwieldy. The inconvenience resulting from this habit of body was not the only evil that attended it. It affected his health, and even threatened to end in serious if not fatal disease. While he was thus made comparatively helpless in body by the infirmities of his advancing age, he was nevertheless as active and restless in spirit as ever. It was, however, no longer the activity of youth and hope and progress which animated him, but rather the fitful uneasiness with which age agitates itself under the vexations which it sometimes has to endure, or struggles convulsively at the approach of real or imaginary dangers threatening the possessions which it has been the work of a life to gain. The dangers in William's case were real, not imaginary. He was continually threatened on every side. In fact, the very year before he died, the dissensions between himself and Robert broke out anew, and he was obliged, unwieldy and helpless as he was, to repair to Normandy, at the head of an armed force, to quell the disturbances which Robert and his partisans had raised. Robert was countenanced and aided at this time by Philip, the King of France, who had always been King William's jealous and implacable rival. Philip, who, as it will be recollected, was very young when William asked his aid at the time of his invasion of England, was now in middle life, and at the height of his power. As he had refused William his aid, he was naturally somewhat envious and jealous of his success, and he was always ready to take part against him.